What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with Tech Daily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a camera comparison test between the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro. Now, the reason I wanted to do this test is because one of the major ways Apple differentiates the Pro iPhones from the standard one is with the camera capabilities. Pro has some additional features and hardware advantages, obviously another whole lens there, but depending on how you use your smartphone, those differences may or may not be worth it. And I wanted to break down exactly what these two phones offer with their cameras so you can be sure you're getting the right setup for your needs. So right off the bat, let's actually start with the selfie cameras. And with this, it's pretty straightforward. Both the iPhone 13 and the 13 Pro have the exact same 12 megapixel f2.2 aperture selfie lenses. And this in turn produces identical selfies on both phones. The 13 Pro doesn't really have any additional hardware advantage, any more software add-ons, no special features or camera modes. The selfies, for all intents and purposes, will pretty much be the exact same. And it doesn't matter if it's a standard selfie, the wide angle selfie, a portrait selfie, the results are about as close as can be. Color temperature is the same, exposure levels are identical. Detail-wise, when we look a little closer, you can see that's all the same too. So if selfies are your thing, just know there's absolutely no advantage here in going with the Pro. The regular iPhone 13 gets you all the same results. Now, with the rear lenses, this is where we have some differences. The biggest difference, obviously, is that additional third lens on the 13 Pro. And this lens is a combination telephoto and macro lens, which allows for both super up-close photography and much better zoom capabilities for capturing things far away. Depending on the scene or the subject, this could potentially unlock a whole bunch of new possibilities when you use the 13 Pro. For example, with small objects or when trying to snap a pic close to the subject, the 13 Pro is going to automatically switch to that macro lens and allow you to get really close. The end result is a much clearer and more detailed image than the regular 13 is able to produce. I used the macro lens a few different times during my tests, and while I initially didn't think it would be too useful, I actually found it did come in handy more times than I expected, mostly because, to be quite honest, the iPhone has generally never really been that good in capturing something so close to the lens. So this macro mode on the 13 Pro winds up being a solid addition. All in all, if you're trying to get up close and personal with whatever you're capturing, the 13 Pro is absolutely going to give you an advantage here. On the flip side, if you need to zoom in on something from far away, the 13 Pro once again is going to do a much better job with that. The third lens on the 13 Pro offers up to 3 times optical zoom, which utilizes the actual lens itself, and up to 15 times digital zoom. The regular iPhone 13 maxes out at just 5 times digital zoom and has no hardware help. So in real-world shooting, when you start to zoom in, you're going to notice almost immediately that the 13 Pro can retain way more detail, especially within that 3 times zoom range. The 13 Pro's telephoto lens is doing all the work initially, and that hardware advantage I think is pretty obvious. At 5 times zoom, the difference is night and day. Remember, this is where the regular iPhone 13 maxes out. You can't get closer than this. While the 13 Pro, on the other hand, still looks really good here and has the ability to get even closer. 15 times max zoom, which honestly still looks pretty good. Now, are you going to be zooming in on every picture you take? Probably not, and a lot of these are very extreme examples, but I think from time to time you'll likely zoom in 2, 3, maybe 5 times, and you're definitely going to notice how much better the 13 Pro does with that. So keep that all in mind, and maybe think about whether or not the zoom capabilities are a worthwhile addition to have. There is one more consideration here. The telephoto lens on the 13 Pro can also be utilized with portrait pictures. Now you can take standard portrait pics with the main lens that come out pretty much the same on both phones. But if you want a totally different look with background blur and depth of field, tapping that little 1x and 3x button on the camera app on the 13 Pro will allow you to switch between the main lens and telephoto lens for your portrait shots. And I think there's some advantage here in doing that. You're once again utilizing the hardware to get the shot. The end result tends to be more detailed with the subject, more blurry with the backgrounds. It's just a whole new look. And I think if portrait pictures are what you're after, this is going to be another worthwhile addition. Overall, the extra third lens on the 13 Pro really does offer a lot, and the handful of features and shooting modes could be worthwhile depending on how often you use those camera modes. So those are sort of the big differences in hardware and capabilities. Now let's dive into just your average everyday pictures and videos. If you're just going to pull your phone out of your pocket and quickly snap a pic, is there any real difference between the regular 13 and 13 Pro? The answer to that question is no. There's not really going to be a noticeable difference in the results. On the one hand, I can sort of see why this is surprising. It feels like Apple tends to highlight the Pro iPhone's camera capabilities as being the best of the best, but when you take a look at the main lens hardware, it's basically the same on both phones. The A15 Bionic chipset is inside both devices too to process the images the same, and there's no additional software add-ons or other changes or features that would impact just your average picture results. In normal lighting conditions, so long as you set the focus the same, the end result should look the same too. Across probably 150 different pictures that I've taken for this test, I really didn't come across anything significant that indicates to me that the 13 Pro is better. Every once in a while, I did notice the color temperature might be a tiny bit different, a little warmer in one image, a little cooler on another, but that didn't happen that often. I also sometimes picked out a slight difference in saturation levels. The regular 13 tended to be a little more punchy and colorful, but again, that occurred maybe once every 25 or 30 shots, and I don't necessarily think it was a purposeful difference. It's kind of hard to get the exact same picture under the exact same conditions on both phones. There's always going to be a slight variation in my hand position or where I tap to focus, or maybe the lighting or scene changed ever so slightly in the second or two between a shot, but I can confidently say 99% of the time, the regular 13 and the 13 Pro will wind up taking pretty much the exact same shot if you're taking simple point and shoot style pictures. Now, what I also found sort of interesting is that in less than ideal lighting conditions, dim scenes, and with night mode too, both phones also wound up taking about the same pictures. I should mention that there is a difference in the aperture across the two phones, f1.6 on the regular 13, f1.5 on the 13 Pro, which means theoretically the Pro might be better in particularly dark scenes, but I just didn't really find that to be the case every single time, at least with my results. For a simple picture in low light, you might see a little more detail on the Pro, or a slightly brighter image, but generally the difference isn't that drastic. However, when you start to play around with the different shooting modes, particularly portrait shots for example, you will actually notice much better results on the 13 Pro. So again, you sort of have to decide what's important here. If you're going to be taking very particular shots and utilizing different lenses for different scenes, the 13 Pro will have an advantage in low light more often than not, but for just simple pictures in good lighting, I'm not seeing anything too significant, which to me is a bit surprising. Now, speaking of the ultra-wide camera, this too is technically a little different across the two phones. It's supposed to be better on the 13 Pro with significantly better aperture for low light. Now again, for your average pick in good lighting, I'm not always seeing a huge difference with the results. Sometimes it's identical, a few other times the 13 Pro might look a little brighter and a little more detailed again, but is it significant? No, not really. For low light and night mode shots though, this is going to be a little more noticeable at times, with the 13 Pro able to capture more detail and often produce a brighter, better looking result. Now I personally do utilize the wide angle lens quite a bit, so for me this was a decent advantage in going with the 13 Pro, but it's not like the regular 13 produced a bad shot in the end anyway. I think overall with pictures on these two phones, the difference you get in going with the Pro maybe won't be felt each and every time you shoot, and for some people the added lenses or additional capabilities might not be a big deal at all. Simple point and shoot pictures in good lighting with the main lens are going to be basically the same across both phones. It's only when you start to utilize the other lenses in shooting modes, or capture low light or very dark scenes, where you'll actually see a more noticeable difference in going with the Pro. Finally, let's just quickly talk about video. Now, a lot of what I said with pictures is going to be the same here. Generally speaking, under the same conditions and shooting modes in the same format, in this case 4K 30 FPS, the results are going to be the same across both phones too. And this is great. Everything from stabilization to the focus to the detail, the color, the exposure, to me it's the same result with both phones, which is awesome. Now obviously there is the added feature of ProRes video on the 13 Pro, but to be completely honest, that's just not something I can personally accurately describe or compare. For professionals, for filming, ProRes is that next level of shooting and editing for video and might be reason enough to go with the 13 Pro, but that's definitely for a very small specific group of folks, not for me at all. Generally speaking, for filming just everyday average stuff, once again, these two iPhones will probably wind up giving giving you pretty similar results. So there you go, that's the story with the new iPhone 13 and 13 Pro in regards to their camera capabilities. I do think that for most people, it's probably not worth it to go Pro based solely on the camera capabilities, simply because you might not be seeing any real world difference in average everyday shooting, but for a select few who utilize the telephoto lens and the macro capabilities and embrace the low light and night mode shots, or can utilize ProRes in their workflow, the 13 Pro definitely still offers more overall. But what do you guys think? Do you think it's worth it to jump to the 13 Pro for its camera capabilities? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow Tech Daily on Twitter and subscribe to the Tech Daily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.